quickest way of ending a war is to lose it, and to lose it on the negotiating table. That's why I think Pokrovsk will be important, whatever happens in the next few weeks.
Hi, I'm James Heappey, and welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. This week, I'm joined by Major General Chip Chapman, who is a former senior British military advisor to US Central Command. Chip, welcome. Full disclosure, we also worked together when Chip was a very senior officer, and I was a very junior young officer in headquarters Northern Ireland as well. So I'm conscious that I mustn't ask Chip any questions that are too challenging for fear that Chip will expose just how useless I was in my military days. But there we go. Chip, very warm welcome to Superpowers. Thank you for joining us. Can we start, please, just by getting your thoughts on progress in Ukraine? I've got to be honest that so much has been going on in the world that I feel like the sort of daily tactical updates that used to dominate the news no longer are really there. So can you give us a sense of what the state is on the ground, why everybody is fighting so fiercely over Pokrovsk, and whether or not we're still inevitably heading towards stalemate, or whether some sort of military success for one side or the other is possible?
It's a great and very involved question that you just asked, James. I think the first thing is the phrase I've always used is an eroding stalemate. And of course, erosion can become a landslide for both sides, either through the political part of the Clausewitzian Trinity or the military part. And it's really been the case recently, I think, that the long-range strikes are shaping the war's future more than frontline developments. But that is absolutely where the importance of Pokrovsk at the moment, I think, comes in, because I think it will fall at some stage, not necessarily this week or in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but it is highly likely in intelligence yardsticks that it will fall and be the first major fall in a way since Avdiivka in February 24. So what is the importance of that? Because really the tactics of the whole thing at the moment, you're right in saying progress is really glacial, even though, a couple hundred square kilometers were captured in October. So I think the importance of Pokrovsk is it really shows three things which can be important for the future, both in the military sense and the political sense. Firstly, that you've got 170,000 sort of soldiers arrayed around Pokrovsk from the Russian sense. And although General Kvoli, the former SACEUR commander, said previously that precision can beat mass, but it takes time, what we've really seen in October is both Russian mass, Russian precision in terms of their use of drones, 5,300 in that month alone, plus Russian dumb bomb mass in terms of 5,000 dumb bomb strikes with glide bombs in October. And mass can actually beat precision if you've got precision alongside it. And at the moment, we've still got this advancing army by Russia, and advancing armies rarely stop fighting when opponents become weaker, which is the perception of Russia. Now, the importance if Pokrovsk falls, therefore, is it potentially gives Russia leverage in negotiations because they want to, I think, negotiate, but they don't want, or they want negotiations, but they don't want to negotiate. So if they come to the table, as they always have, with the fact that Ukraine should recognize the territorial realities alongside the sort of root causes nonsense about denazification, demilitarization, a neutral Ukraine and all that, Trump might buy into that because Trump likes winners. He doesn't like losers. And losing a key city like that is therefore important from a Russian perspective. It'll also not be great for the morale of the Ukrainians. And technically, it would open up the sort of future domination of the Donbass. It opens the route to Dnipropetrovsk, which also could mean that you have a Kursk in reverse from a Russian perspective, where they could make incursions into Kursk, not large scale, I don't think, because I don't think they have that capability. But that also becomes a sort of negotiating trading point, as it were. I don't think that they have the capability, nor do I think they have the armored mass to sort of envelop the fortress cities of further north of Petrovsk. But that is the importance of it. So it's that tactical battle, which Pokrovsk is. I think there's been too much made in previously about using sort of Bakhmut and Avdiivka. People have used the notion of, it's operationally significant, strategically significant, without understanding what the terms actually mean. But of course, tactical battles are sequenced in support of operational objectives to strategic ends. And it does help Russia in that sort of way, and therefore brings you again into the sort of Steve Witkoff thing about the quickest way of ending a war is to lose it, and to lose it on the negotiating table. That's why I think Pokrovsk will be important, whatever happens in the next few weeks.
And since Trump came into office and made it very clear that he wanted to see an end game in Ukraine, are we seeing a Russian strategy that has visibly altered in order to shape the end game? Or is this just a continuation of Russia's slow grind forwards, and for them it's just keep progressing, keep gaining territory, and if an end game is forced on us, then fine, but otherwise we stick with plan A?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a continuation. And something that struck me this week was, of course, Stalin, for example, won the Second World War, not necessarily just by the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, but he won it at the conference table at Yalta. And that is what I think Putin seeks to do again. And indeed, there was a time in 1948 when the Gerasimov equivalent, when Stalin asked Russian Chief of General Staff at the time, why did we win the war? He didn't allow the general to answer, but he said, because I prepared the country for war. And with 25 years of Putin in power, either as president or prime minister, that is what he's done in three areas, I think. Firstly, by the sort of digital and analog authoritarianism within Russia. Secondly, he's prepared the informational battle space, both internally and what he seeks to do internationally, using useful idiots, Orban, and a sort of slight fracture in the Central European countries. And thirdly, in the disinformation space in open societies. So I think there is a continuation of that Stalin approach from Putin, and he's not going to change from that. And again, you asked about military victory. There's only three ways that wars really end: by decisive military victory, that is not going to happen; by the improbability of military victory, and there is an improbability of military victory at the strategic level; or by unacceptable costs, and those are all to do with economic costs, political costs, moral or military or demographic costs. Now, again, I think we underestimate Putin in this regard, and one of the 7 deadly biases of an analyst, which I like to think myself of at the moment, is what we call fundamental attribution error. That is, if you just took in as a two-bode statistics, from the end of October, that the losses that the Russians had in October 25,000 people killed or wounded in action, are phenomenal, alongside the 1,150,000, which is the aggregated number of killed or wounded in action. Now, most rational people would say that's insane. You should sue for some sort of peace, a just peace or surrender peace, or whatever peace Putin wants. Of course, he wants a surrender peace from a Ukrainian perspective, and in the way that Ukraine wants a just peace. And at the moment, the gap between those two positions is too great for any sense of negotiation on the battlefield. But I do think the important thing of last week is those bold statistics, which I've just mentioned, are actually irrelevant in the sort of society that Putin has created. And the most important thing that I think happened last week is not what happened on the battlefield, but that the Duma signed into law on the 6th of November this notion of potentially a rolling mobilization with 2 million reservists who can be mobilized for use in Russia. of which, of course, the occupied territories now form part of that. And he can do that without the need for the declaration of martial law, and therefore overcome the potential problems that he had in September 22 when there was a partial mobilization. So keeping a sort of eye on how that progresses in terms of, does it mean that they can produce mass that's not the same as capability, because they don't have the equipment really, certainly in maneuver terms anymore, to field an army of 2 million, but it would overcome their problem of paying contract soldiers potentially in 2026. There is not going to be a military or negotiated settlement in 2025. I just don't see that.
It's a really interesting question. We're now sort of deep into the generation of a Russian third or even fourth echelon, enormous 2 million people now at the disposal of the Russian military. There are also stories about veterans who have already been caused a disability as a consequence of being wounded in action, now being redeployed to the front line. And the question, therefore, is this a reflection of Russian desperation, or actually is this Russia generating a very large, very battle-hardened army? And A, what does that mean for the Ukrainians' ability to resist? But also B, for NATO, who always reassure themselves that they are technologically superior. Well, I've heard many a general say that mass has a quality all of its own, and having 2 million people with battle experience is not to be sniffed at.
Well, both of those can be true at the same time. It can be both a sign of desperation and a sign that Russia's ability to force generate, both in terms of industrial mass and manpower, is better than the Ukrainians. And that is obviously the long-term problem for Ukrainians. And ultimately, we always say that total means multiplied by your strength of will gives you the power of resistance. And it is that power of resistance which we're never really sure on, both in terms of the will of the Ukrainians, although for them it absolutely is existential, because the product of losing would be that Ukraine would probably cease to exist as a nation. But on the reverse side, it's this thing which Sir Richard Moore, the head of MI6, said in September 24, from Putin's perspective, that never take a tight grip for a secure grip. And then we come back to the Clausewitzian Trinity and where we started about the long-range strikes setting the future more than the tactical close battle banging and throwing between the Ukrainians and the Russians on the front line, which is, and again, it's always very difficult to measure this as a metric. When does the point come that either the population of Russia or of Ukraine say enough is enough because they can't get their liters of fuel for either heating or move their cars, or there's an elite defection within the circle of Putin? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a Western-friendly government around in the future, or the army, rather like 1917 and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Russian army just marches off the battlefield, or you amplify the number of people who are sort of mutinying and walking off the battlefield anyway. For example, last week there was a figure of, in the Kharkiv region, of 4,500 Russian soldiers deserting. Measuring those things again in metric terms is always very, very difficult to do, because the imponderable in all this is how long will people fight, how well will they fight, and for how long are they able to sustain that fight. Now, Europe must try in physical terms to sustain that fight. It's very difficult to measure that the will, the moral component of both Russia and Ukraine to sustain that for the future.
We've had some really interesting conversations about the moral components of fighting power on Superpowers over the last couple of months. And I think there's always a danger that what we understand to be the moral component of fighting power for Western militaries is just entirely different in in the Russian mindset. And they're not 12 feet tall. We're seeing all of these defections. Surely within Russian society, there must be increasing unease about the number of people that are being killed and maimed, and indeed the constant requirement for even more people. But I just have this real sense of dread that in Russia, everything that you would think might cause some sort of, rebellion within the elite or public outrage leading to protest and change in policy just won't happen because Russian society is fundamentally different.
I tend to agree with that. So there's an imbalance of sacrifice really in Russia, and I don't think Putin really cares what happens in the sacrifice of people from the parts of the Russian Federation which aren't in Western Russia in terms of, St. Petersburg and Moscow. The imbalance of sacrifice in Buryatia and Tuva and some of the other parts of the Russian Federation, that is where you could potentially have these centrifugal forces, because one of the concerns of the West has always been, I think, that when you go back to, for example, to the Skripal incident, one of the things that I always used to say then, that one of the refrains in Russia at the time, and this is way before the formal attack, of course, it's a few years on from the 2014 annexation of Crimea, was no future. That was the refrain generally in Russia, because all the indicators in terms of GDP, populations were all downwards. And so there was this fear that you would have an implosion within Russia and a fragmentation of the Russian Federation. And therefore you would end up with a Bosnia with nukes sort of scenario. And that's one of the problems in terms of scaling, I think, the support which Europe has had. That would not be a friendly outcome for the West. That is probably why the sort of notion of a surrender peace from a Russian perspective on Ukraine is tenable, whereas the notion of a surrender peace from the West towards Russia is not something we would probably want. You could get, therefore, to a sort of the real end state, a bad end state, often called the sort of Carthaginian peace from the Punic War, where, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. I think Russia must be defeated, but I don't think Russia must be destroyed. But again, where the cursor is put on that is very, very difficult. And, you used to have far more secret intelligence than I've had the last few years. And that is the difficulty in understanding where that would go in the future.
Indeed. I'm also fascinated to read reports of Putin being open to sending advanced weaponry to Venezuela. And I understand how, in his sense of himself as a sort of major superpower in the world and a leader within a counter movement to the United States, he would want to be seen to be helping Venezuela. But in my last year or so as a minister, I was all over the Central Asia, Vietnam, colleagues were in India, discussions with the Egyptians and all sorts, where traditional customers for Russian defense exports were rapidly reappraising their view of exports from the West because Russia simply couldn't deliver. How on earth, now that we are 3 or 4 years into the war, does he think he's going to free up advanced capability to send to Venezuela and not need it in Ukraine?
Well, there are various methods of escalation, and one of them is rhetorical escalation, and the second one is weapons escalation. A third one is geographical escalation. I think in terms of Venezuela being the principal partner of Russia in sort of Central South America, Putin has to say those sort of things. But Putin is not going to sacrifice Russia for a small country. A big country never sacrifices itself for a small country. And in terms of vital national interest, rather like Trump doesn't see Ukraine as a vital national interest for America, I don't think Putin will ultimately see Venezuela as a vital national interest for Russia. So I don't think that is tenable if he really wants to play four-dimensional chess with Trump. The quickest way to annoy Trump and probably get Trump to deliver Tomahawk missiles, because at the moment he has strategic hesitancy on that, is to formally declare that he is going to deliver and tries to deliver. Oreshnik was one of his ministers last week saying that. Now, that said, Venezuela and Russia have had a formal military agreement which was signed in 2025, military technical agreement in terms of countering terrorism and looking to bilateral agreements for the future. And they have delivered £4 billion worth of military aid in the last few years. And in terms of the axis which we've looked at in the last year in terms of Russia, China, and Iran, all those three countries have capabilities which have been delivered, which the Americans would need to neutralize if they were to do any sort of stuff outside of the maritime interdiction, which they're doing at the moment. For example, there are anti-ship missiles, which are both Chinese 802s and Iranian anti-ship missiles. Some of the tactics of the Venezuelans, if they were to come out and confront the American Navy, would be based on IRGC swarm boats technology. And there are cruise missiles which have been delivered to Venezuela, which will be fired from Su-30s. And so it would be interesting in terms of technological terms, I don't mean this in human terms, if that confrontation were to take place. And if the Americans were to do that, of course, it would be a neutralization campaign of the radar systems if they were to do anything on land. I don't think there's a imperative for the Americans to do that at the moment, because it's easy for the Americans, as it is for the Russians in a way. It's the ability to go and take things out, destroy things, is far easier than the ability to hold things, and particularly if the Americans wanted to go and take and hold the Venezuelan oil fields, for example. And that's one of the problems I think we're seeing in the American approach at the moment to Venezuela, is it's not clear what the strategic end game is. It's easy at the tactical level to do the maritime interdiction and the counter-narcotics, but it's kind of whack-a-mole thing, a bit like Afghanistan. Now, I'm not suggesting Venezuela is like Afghanistan, because the real difference there is, of course, there were no other means of economic potential for the Afghanistanis when we were trying to eradicate their poppy crop, whereas Venezuela has the potential to be a middling power, given its oil resources, which are grossly underproduced because of the fact it's had such a authoritarian and useless government, both under Chávez and Maduro.
Indeed, it is just a further example of what remarkable times we're living in, though, where there is a threat in the Middle East that pervades. A lot of the Islamic State ideology lives on and grows in insurgent groups on continental Africa. The threat of the Taiwan trigger and war in the Indo-Pacific remains. There is already war in Europe, and now there is the prospect of conflict in the Caribbean too. And so it just jars a little, to move our conversation closer to home, that the UK, in my opinion, and I accept that I am sort of politically biased, but it just feels to me as if the UK is not moving at the pace that it should be to restore our conventional deterrence, so that we have the hard power necessary to force a continuation of politics rather than a resort to violence, because no one wants to take us on in a fight. And if the moment for a fight comes, that we're ready for it. Chip, am I being unnecessarily harsh, or do you share those concerns?
Well, you're being slightly political, of course, in your approach, because the phrase I always use of this comes from Montgomery when he was de-sacker to Eisenhower. and that was that the test match is postponed indefinitely due to the deterrent nature and strength of NATO. I think, again, looking at sort of metrics in the last few months, or last week actually, Mark Rutte said, for example, that NATO is now outproducing Russia in terms of ordnance, and the increase in artillery in the last 2 years, I think he said, is sixfold. We'll be producing 2 million shells a year, and I think the recent defence budget has said that defence paper has said that NATO first is our policy. NATO, in my view, is generally stronger than it was before the Russian invasion, and of course we've added Sweden and Finland to the mix. What is therefore always key is, again, the military potential when mobilized of NATO is far greater than Russia, but that does mean that you need political will of a number of countries to come together. And of course, it is far stronger if America is alongside than if America is not alongside. I think the phrase, again, that I always use is from my own mentor, General Mattis, that you need the least regrets when the crisis starts. Do we still have the least regrets at the moment from a UK military perspective? Probably not. We are probably a little bit too small. We're still grappling with issues of recruitment. What will the future look like? And I know, for example, from an army perspective, CGS is talking about 20% of manned weapons, 40% manned autonomous weapons, and 40% throwaway kind of weapons in terms of UAS and all those other systems. I think we need to go to something like that. But again, just in terms of the sword and the shield, you're never really sure what is primus inter pares at the time. Are drones really the future, or is that going to be absolutely negated in the next few years by electronic warfare, lasers and all that? That is the really cripplingly difficult question to answer if you're trying to look at force structure and force capabilities for the future. So the real thing I would worry about is partly that, but partly to do with how, if the Russians were to do anything in Europe, and I don't think they've exhausted their political appetite to regain lost territory and spheres of influence, and if they've got this endurance in terms of their ability to mobilize people, I do think we need to get pretty serious about regeneration and reconstitution, which were and always have been strategic concepts of how you flesh out a force, a bigger force, both in terms of industrial potential and personnel potential. And I don't think we've really grappled with those enough in the future. I don't take a sort of somber view when we have statistics, for example, in the YouGov polls, which came about when, for example, Penny Mordaunt was talking about some sort of national service, be it national civil service, that only 10% of people would be willing to sign up and fight. 10% of each age group from 18 gives you 770,000, 75,000 18-year-olds and 75,000 19-year-olds, and so on. So that would give you enough of a core. So I don't take it in a negative thing. I take that as almost a positive statistic, and that statistic would get better, I think, if we were under an existential threat. That said, my view is that the quickest way for us to sustain the long peace, which effectively from a British perspective in Europe we've had since the Second World War, is to support and sustain Ukraine to ensure that Russia is not successful there.
We're galloping rapidly towards the end of our time, but I just want to pick up on your very interesting analysis of how hard it is to transform the force before you really know what the lessons are that you should or shouldn't learn from Ukraine. And I agree with you that there are an awful lot of people that have embraced the idea that all war is now about drones, and that ignores the sort of the speed at which industry is now innovating counter drone technologies, as well as electronic warfare, and B, the peculiarities of the Ukrainian battle space and how different they would be from a war that involved NATO. Most obviously, the almost complete absence of close air support, and thus the drones can operate in a pretty much uncontested contested airspace. So if you were in CGS's shoes, now CGS for our non-UK viewers is the head of the British Army, and he has committed himself to transform the force in the sort of ratios that you described, Chip. How do you've got to get going. You've got to start placing some bets. Probably you've got to start disinvesting in some of the sort of traditional platforms of tanks and helicopters and infantry fighting vehicles in order to create the budget to bring in all of the autonomous stuff. What are the safe bets and what are the things that he should pause and think about further?
I'd approach the question slightly differently, and I'd be CDS, James, and that is, I think you have to look at British defence in the round, and because of our peculiar position as an island nation, it's always been my view, and this has always been the problem for the army, that the RAF and the Navy are actually more important than the army, and it's always been that dilemma for the army about limited liability or continental commitment. And if you look at the factors for success in the 20th century, I don't think these have altered that much in the 21st century. The first one was control of the air. You still need that control of the air, and I know you mentioned about close air support there. It's control of the air gives you the ability to shape every other domain. Now, of course, these days we also have the two further domains of space power and cyber. So it's looking at all those in the round. And indeed, that is the challenge for the future in terms of the using data and everything else in a speedy way, but in a mission command environment, so that your OODA loop, the observe, orientate, decide, act, is greater than the enemy. And that is exactly to go full circle in terms of where future conflict might come about, is what they're looking at from an American and Taiwanese perspective against how China may go about trying to invade Taiwan. So to really answer your question, sunset capabilities, it's really difficult to see. So, people would say the tank is obsolete, but in 1918 they said the infantry is obsolete because, of course, the major casualties in the First World War were the infantry. It's absolutely clear to me that if you've got a balanced all arms type environment, which does have the ability to move, to protect itself in the air environment, to have drones or some sort of artillery equivalent with it, if that is balanced and packaged properly, you still have an ability, I think, with electronic warfare bubbles around that, to survive in a modern battlefield. And at the end of the day, you can have as much exotica as you want, but you cannot win a war just by lobbing shells from afar. I still believe that you need to go and take ground, and if you can't do that, you've got to try and break the will of either the political entity or the military entity of the people that you're opposing. That is what, of course, Russia got wrong so early on. They thought that the Thunder Run to Kyiv would be over in 3 or 5 days, and they would knock over the political polity. And that's what they really needed to do to have some sort of strategic outcome. It's that which is more important. And therefore, one of the things which you've got to make sure is correct for the future, which is what I was going to say to you at the beginning, was that, of course, the strategy bridge between political intent and military power, particularly within a NATO context, needs to be absolutely tight, or that's where the problem will be, which can be fractured by this disinformation of open societies or the preparation of the informational battlefield, which I started on.
Chip, fascinating. We must get you back on to talk about sort of strategic resilience and all of the pillars of that, because my sense is that you've been thinking about it in a really interesting way, and I'd love to carry on the conversation. But for now, our thanks to Major General Chip Chapman, former senior British military advisor to US Central Command. You've been watching Superpowers, the future of global security, here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's fantastic geopolitical content, please make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. But for now, I'm James Heappey. See you next week.